This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company. For more information and links to all our great podcasts, visit hartmanmedia.com.
Welcome to the American Monetary Association's podcast, where we explore how monetary policy impacts the real lives of real people and the action steps necessary to preserve wealth and enhance one's lifestyle.
It's my pleasure to welcome Richard Rahn. He is chairman of the Institute for Global Economic Growth, former economic advisor to President George H.W. Bush, and vice president and chief economist of the United States Chamber of Commerce during the Reagan administration. Richard, welcome. How are you?
I'm just fine.
It's good to have you. And where are you located?
I'm in Great Falls, Virginia now.
Fantastic. Well, you are a fan of cryptocurrencies, and I guess it's almost a little bit surprising, maybe not, I don't know, I'm a little surprised, to see someone who's, worked in government and around government for so long and be a fan of digital money, but you were working on it long before we ever heard of Bitcoin, right?
Yes. Back in 1976, the great Nobel Prize winner, Austrian economist F.A. Hayek, wrote a book called Denationalization of Money. And at the time, I was fascinated by that book because he laid out how there was no reason for money to be produced by government. In fact, historically, it had been private. And it got me to thinking, and at that point, I was also an advisor to the New York Mercantile Exchange, the big commodity exchange. And we were looking around for new things to trade. And so I had started fiddling around with the idea of currency baskets or commodity baskets based on a lot of Hayek's work. There was a lot of problems back then doing it from a technical standpoint. And so 20 years ago, I wrote a book called The End of Money and a Struggle for Financial Privacy, of how a digital money could operate. And that was before Bitcoin and the advent of the blockchain, which made a lot of this possible. But my real fascination and concern is the idea of private non-government monies. But, of course, in the modern world, they would all be digital and encrypted. And that's how I got where I am.
Well, that's quite interesting. Richard, I can see, and I'm a fan of F.A. Hayek, of course, but I can see how there isn't a need for governments to run the currency. But from a government's perspective, they wouldn't want to give up that control, would they? And from a central banker's perspective, they wouldn't want to give up that control. I mean, that's in essence their biggest product. I would argue that the biggest product of any government is its currency. Feel free to take issue with that, but why would a government want to give up control of these things?
You're definitely right, and they don't want to give up control. But the idea of central banks is something relatively new in human history. The first one was in Sweden in the 1600s. But they didn't really catch on until the late 1800s, and it wasn't until the 1880s that the Bank of England became actually part of the government. Before that, it was private. We did not have a central bank in the United States until the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, set up the Fed in 1914. And countries got along perfectly well without central banks. And central banks, of course, gave a huge amount of power to people in government. And as you know, people in government love power more than anything. But the central banks have had a very poor track record. Back when we were on the gold standard, so the world was on a gold standard really from 1870s till 1914. It was one of the most prosperous eras ever in the world. It was the first era of globalization. You didn't have periods of rampant inflation, quick recessions, they used to call them panics, but they usually only lasted a few months. And so you had actually a more stable world. And then once you had central banks, which took over from the gold standard, it was a period of time where you still had gold. But let's say the last 30 years, 40 years, where you've had just strictly fiat currencies without a specific backing, that has not been particularly well for the world monetary order.
I wouldn't disagree with any of that. I'm just saying, what would be a government's motivation to ever allow this? In fact, one of the arguments I've made many times is, as much as I would love to be wrong about cryptocurrencies, but I don't think I'm going to be, the powers that be just aren't going to let them take over in any real way, I don't think. I'd love to be wrong about it, but Why would they? Why wouldn't they just ultimately, if cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, etc., got too powerful, if they got too much of a foothold, they might just make them illegal or do something to make it very difficult to trade. Maybe there'll be a crisis of some sort, a fraud. Maybe they'll engineer it, right?
Here in the U.S., one little sneaky thing they do is requiring you, if you trade Bitcoin, every time you make a purchase or sale, you're supposed to record it all as a capital gain or capital loss. And so, of course, the record-keeping requirements here are mind-boggling complex. That's just one little thing they do. And there's no revenue gain to government with that because it's a zero-sum game. But that's just the kind of harassment that they engage in. And so you've got the old classic battle between those who want freedom and those in government who try to put the foot on freedom. And this struggle will go on. But I think ultimately governments will lose because the advances in encryption and with the internet and things like the blockchain make it increasingly difficult and very costly for government to go after everybody. My view is what will happen is there will be many different types of what we broadly refer to as cryptocurrencies. I'm one who believes they need to be backed by something real rather than just a computer algorithm in the way that Bitcoin is. But there's people trying to do crypto gold, crypto silver, other precious metals and so forth. I've got a company where we're doing aluminum. But these experiments will take place. They'll serve certain markets, and people will increasingly find their ways around government currencies. Now, if you start to have rapid inflation again, in the way we had in the late 1970s, the movement towards cryptocurrencies will really be accelerated. The thing that's holding it back now is the fact that we have virtually no inflation,
right.
But that's not a permanent condition.
Yeah, I agree. But the movement, the people may want it, but the governments don't want it, right? So, and the central bankers don't want it. If a cryptocurrency took over, would the Fed just close and say, oh, well, I guess you don't need us anymore, bye?
Eventually that could happen. We take a look at the people can override the will of government. Let's just take something like marijuana, which has been illegal all through my lifetime, but increasing numbers of people smoked marijuana. And finally, the government has been giving in sort of state by state. And we can pick up other things like that, where the government that would love to control, and they'll try to, but they'll lose the battle. That's the thing that really protects our Second Amendment, is the fact that it's going to be very hard for government ever to get everybody's guns.
Yeah.
If we were a society which didn't have wide gun ownership, then government could easily do it. But the fact is, since we got more guns than people, the idea of government going in and taking everybody's guns is just not realistic.
Right, but the government has much more powerful things than the firearms we can own, obviously. I don't know. I mean, conceptually, I agree with you, but from a practical point of view, if the government wants to get them, they'll get them. The government's a pretty strong adversary.
Yeah, they can target anybody, and they can target every one of us because there's something like more than 4,000 federal felonies. So most people can't go a week without committing a couple of felonies.
I had the author of 3 felonies a day on the show. I mean, everybody's just breaking the law all the time now. Every single person listening is breaking laws they don't even know exist. It's absolutely ridiculous.
So the government can always target anybody. But the government trying to target everybody, and the cost of doing this. Let's say with a cryptocurrency, let's say you're in some foreign country, and we decide to trade whatever by some cryptocurrency, whether it be Bitcoin or digital gold or whatever. And if you're doing it encrypted, peer-to-peer, if the government focuses on either one of us, they eventually could find this. But the cost of doing this for so many transactions becomes overwhelming. And it's a battle, I think. I mean, I tend to be an optimist. I think it's a battle that governments will ultimately lose. And I sure hope they do.
Yeah.
There's no reason for them to have monopoly on money, because like every other monopoly, they've screwed it up.
And they don't need to have a monopoly on money and taxation at the same time, because they can simply tax everybody by inflating the currency. That's a tax. it's totally interesting how the IRS and the Federal Reserve came about right around the same time, within about a year of each other. To have both, it's like this double checkmate. You can have one or the other. You can have a taxing agency and tell people to pay their share, or you can have the currency and you can inflate away the value of it. But in our case, since 1913 or so, they can do both.
Yep.
Simultaneously, right? Okay, so diving into the cryptocurrency side of things and the digital money side of things, who do you think will be the winner in this game? Will it be the sort of the original Bitcoin, or will it be one of the others? What are your thoughts about the huge landscape of digital money out there?
Well, Bitcoin had the advantage of being first and grabbing market share, but since it's basically based on a computer algorithm, even though it's proved to be unbreakable, I just become a bit of a skeptic that can hold up over the long run. And I am one who believes that the money should be anchored in something real, but it can be totally digital and encrypted. And again, any metal, any precious metal, any commercial metal will do, or even you could do various agriculturals. I mean, Hayek, going back to his book in '76, thought there'd be commodity baskets, which would be the basis. And it could be. And there's a lot of experiments taking place now. There's probably several thousand people are out there, like I am, experimenting with various things. And the markets will ultimately determine. People forget that 100 years ago, at the beginning of the automobile age, we had more than 2,000 different makers of automobiles in the U.S.
Yep.
It hadn't been sorted out whether we were going to have steam-driven automobiles or electric or diesel or gasoline engines or whatever. And all these things got sorted out by the market, and then you went down to an oligopoly. The same thing will eventually happen probably with digital monies. People will try lots of different things, and eventually certain things will show to be better than others. And there's no reason why you can't have specialized currencies for certain types of transactions which may not be applicable to others.
Why is it that you say Bitcoin won't work because of the algorithm, because it's basically a bunch of code? What's the problem with that? Is it the slow processing time as so many people use it, or what? Because
the way it's structured, the processing time will increase in the cost of that. But even though it looks unbreakable now, something will happen. I have no idea what, but somebody will find a way to mess it up, because they do it with everything. And because there's no there. And again, I'm old fashioned. I like to be able to hold my money. And even though you say, well, you're doing aluminum, you can't hold much in terms of value in your hand, but we can store it around the world, and it serves as a perfectly fine store of value. Again, a computer algorithm, well, let's say you had one of these global cyber attacks by North Korea or somebody, which shuts down the electrical grids every place. Then Bitcoin is dead for a while until things reestablish. But if you have something real, you may not be able to transact for some period of time, but the value is still there.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your career, if you would, and what it was like to work in the Reagan administration, for the Chamber of Commerce in the Reagan administration, and then with George H.W. Bush.
Well, I started off as a professor, and then I ran American Council for Capital Formation, and I got involved with the original supply side group, Art Laffer and some of his colleagues back in the late 70s. And Ronald Reagan used to say, well, unlike the rest of us, he didn't have to unlearn the economics he learned, because he learned his economics. He had a degree in economics before Keynes wrote his book. So he had it right from the beginning. But we had a group of people worked on the tax policy side, very bright, very innovative. And it was exciting times because, we were shifting the whole economic policy making during the 80s and early 90s, where Reagan really was interested in economics and understood it and could engage in a substantive discussion. The first George Bush quickly learned nice man, smart man, but he didn't really care too much about economics. He wanted his advisors just to come up with conclusions. He wasn't interested in that much in
in the detail.
Yeah.
And to contrast that with his predecessor, Reagan, so Reagan was quite interested, right? He had Arthur Laffer, and, he was very into it, right?
Yeah, he clearly understood it all, and that was an interest. George Bush, his interest was more in foreign policy and some other things.
Right.
And he just plain wasn't interested to any particular depth on this stuff. Mm-hmm. And so that's one reason he got off track, because we designed the flexible freeze and no tax increases, which he ran on in 88.
Right.
But he quickly banned it in 89. Yep. And at which point I said, I'm out of here. Mm-hmm. I didn't think it would work. And of course it didn't. We went into the recession needlessly. But those things you live and learn.
Yep, definitely.
And after that, I basically became much more entrepreneurial, built some businesses, and I had gotten interested in the economic transition in Eastern Europe. I had some experience working in the communist countries. I ended up chairing the Bulgarian transition team and also serving as an advisor to Gaidar, who was the first non-communist prime minister in Russia. And those were very fascinating years, talking about the starting really 1990 through 94, 5. And the fact that you could go in there and have some influence on a total economic transformation of the country was a very exciting time for economists. And we built a number of joint ventures during that time. I had brought in some U.S. businessmen, because from my years at the Chamber, I knew a number of CEOs. And so we created some joint ventures, and all that was very interesting. And I did that for about 15 years.
Yeah. Good stuff. Richard, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. Be sure to check out the show's specific website and our general website, hartmanmedia.com, for appropriate disclaimers and terms of service. Remember that guest opinions are their own, and if you require specific legal or tax advice or advice in any other specialized area, please consult an appropriate professional. And we also very much appreciate you reviewing the show. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher Radio or whatever platform you're using and write a review for the show. We would very much appreciate that. And be sure to make it official and subscribe so you do not miss any episodes. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.